Oh, the Henderson family's Cessna Citation. Have you ever wondered what goes through a pilot's mind when everything goes wrong at 43,000 feet? When you have seconds to make decisions that separate life from death for people who trust you blindly? Well, I found out the hard way that being a private pilot isn't just about flying luxury jets and serving wealthy families. Sometimes it's about carrying the weight of entire lives in your hands when the impossible happens. My name is Captain Edward Morrison. I have 20 years of experience flying everything from single engines to wide bodies, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for those 15 minutes that forever changed how I view aviation. This is the story of how an engine that exploded over the Rocky Mountains nearly cost the lives of an entire family I swore to protect, and how I discovered that sometimes the difference between a hero and a tragedy is just a few degrees of bank angle and a silent prayer. December 2023. It had been exactly 3 years since I started working as the private pilot for the Henderson family, one of the most influential dynasties in American agribusiness. Robert Henderson had built an empire exporting corn and soybeans to the entire world. And when his fortune exceeded $2 billion, he decided it was time to have his own jet. That's how I met Charlie Delta, November 847 Alpha, a Cessna Citation X, affectionately known by the family as Lone Star. It wasn't just an airplane to them, it was a symbol of achievement, a piece of the sky that belonged exclusively to the Hendersons. For me, it was my office, my responsibility, and secretly my passion. The Citation X isn't just any aircraft. With its two Rolls-Royce AE 3007C1 engines, it was capable of flying at Mach 0.935, making it one of the fastest executive jets in the world. Almost 2,500 miles of range, service ceiling of 51,000 feet, and an elegance that made any pilot feel privileged to be at the controls. Robert Henderson was a 58-year-old man, salt and pepper hair, always impeccably styled, who treated everyone with genuine respect, rarely seen in people of his position. His wife, Carol, 52, was a former teacher who never lost her down-to-earth nature, even after all the wealth. They had 3 children, Michael, 28, fresh out of business school and clearly being groomed to take over the business. Sophia, 25, an architect living in New York who was always working on some innovative project. And Julian, 22, still in college studying agricultural engineering, but who already showed he'd inherited his father's business vision. What made this family special wasn't just the money, it was how they treated each other. In 3 years flying with them, I never saw a serious argument, never witnessed disrespect between them. Robert always asked about my family. Carol always brought homemade cookies for the longer trips, and the kids treated me like a beloved uncle, not an employee. That made my job much more than just piloting an airplane. I was, in a way, the guardian of people I genuinely respected and admired. That December 22nd, we were scheduled to fly from Dallas to Aspen, Colorado. It was the family's traditional end-of-year trip. They had a house in the mountains where they always spent Christmas and New Year's skiing and enjoying time together. It was a tradition that started when Robert was still building his empire, and one they maintained religiously, even after all the wealth. The morning was perfect at Dallas Love Field. Clear skies, calm winds, unlimited visibility. I had arrived at the airport at 5 a.m. to do my pre-flight inspection, as I always did. The Citation was spotless. The mechanics from the maintenance company had just completed the scheduled inspection the previous week, and all systems were functioning perfectly. The planned route was fairly direct. Dallas, Panama City for refueling, Denver, Aspen. Total of approximately 12 hours of flight time, including stops. The Citation X had the range to fly direct to Panama without problems, and from there we'd continue to Denver, where we'd make our final tech stop before the last leg to Aspen. At 7:30, the family arrived at the airport. As always, punctual and in good spirits. Robert was excited talking about the ski slopes they planned to explore this year. Carol was showing photos on her phone of the preparations the housekeeper was making at the Aspen house. Michael was discussing with Sophia about the best location for the New Year's party they traditionally organized, while Julian was immersed in a book about sustainable agriculture. "Good morning, Captain Edward." Robert greeted me with a firm handshake and his characteristic smile. "Ready for another adventure in the mountains?" "Always ready, Mr. Robert. We've got a beautiful day to fly, minimal turbulence forecast, and good weather along the entire route." Carol approached with a maternal smile. "Edward, I brought those chocolate chip cookies you like. They're in the thermal bag." That was typical of her. Even going to a house where they had staff and every comfort possible, Carol always thought of others. That genuine kindness was one of the things that impressed me most about the family. At 8:15, we were taxiing for takeoff. The Citation responded perfectly to the controls. The engines had all temperatures and pressures within normal parameters. Lovefield Tower cleared our takeoff on runway 31. Right? And at 8:23, we were airborne, climbing smoothly toward our cruise level of 41,000 feet. The first leg of the trip went without incident. The family was relaxed, chatting. Sophia was working on her projects on the laptop. Michael was analyzing some company reports, and Robert and Carol were planning trip details. Julian, as always, was studying. It was impressive how seriously that young man took his studies. We arrived in Panama around 11:30 local time. Refueling was quick and efficient. I took advantage to do another visual inspection of the plane while we waited for tower clearance for our next leg. Everything continued perfect. At 12:45, we took off from Panama bound for Denver. This would be the longest leg of the flight, approximately 6 hours and 30 minutes. The Citation climbed smoothly through scattered cloud layers, and within minutes we were flying over the infinite Pacific blue. The family had lunched during the stopover and was now quieter. Robert was dozing in his favorite seat, Carol was reading a novel, and the kids were entertained with their activities. It was the kind of peaceful flight every pilot appreciates. Systems functioning perfectly, good weather, comfortable passengers. It was almost meditative being there at the controls, monitoring instruments and navigating through the infinite sky. Around 3:30 p.m. local time, we were flying over the west coast of Mexico when I began noticing some towering cumulus clouds forming ahead of us. Nothing too serious, just some isolated cells I could easily navigate around. I requested a route change from Los Angeles Center Air Traffic Control, which promptly cleared me for a 20-mile deviation to the left. Citation 847 Alpha, Los Angeles Center. Traffic your right, 2 o'clock. Same level. Boeing 737 eastbound. Traffic in sight. Citation 847 Alpha, I replied, spotting the silver dot of the 737 in the distance. It was a beautiful day to fly. Unlimited visibility, favorable winds, and we were making excellent time. The weather forecast for Denver was good, and Aspen was reporting clear skies with winds of only 8 knots. Everything indicated we'd arrive on schedule, and the family would have a quiet evening to settle into the house before the vacation really began. It was around 4:45 p.m. when we were flying over Arizona that everything changed. I was doing my routine instrument check when I heard a sound that shouldn't be there. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but after 20 years of flying, you develop sensitivity to every sound, every vibration, every nuance the aircraft produces. It was like a faint, intermittent humming coming from the right side. I immediately began scanning the right engine instruments: exhaust gas temperature, RPM, oil pressure, oil temperature, fuel pressure. Everything within normal parameters, but that sound was still there. "Michael," I called softly, not wanting to alarm anyone. "Could you come here for a moment?" Michael was the only one in the family who had a private pilot license and understood aviation somewhat. Sometimes I'd ask his opinion about sounds or vibrations, not because I needed to, but because he liked feeling useful. "What's up, Captain? Are you hearing any unusual noise?" He stayed silent for a few seconds, concentrating. "Now that you mention it, there seems to be a very faint humming. Is that normal?" "Probably just the air conditioning working a bit harder due to the desert heat, but I'll monitor it closely." Michael returned to his seat, apparently calm, but I wasn't calm. That noise was gradually intensifying, and my experience told me something wasn't right. At 5:02 p.m., all my worst fears were confirmed at once. First was the vibration, a severe shudder that started on the right side and spread throughout the aircraft. Then the alarms began sounding. The red master warning lit up like an emergency beacon, and the voice alert system began its terrifying litany. Engine failure, engine failure. But it wasn't just a failure, it was an explosion. The blast was deafening, a metallic, violent sound, as if someone had detonated a bomb inside the right engine. The aircraft was shaken so violently that Robert woke immediately, and Carol let out a scream of fright. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," I shouted into the radio. "Los Angeles Center, citation 847 Alpha. We have an engine explosion. Requesting vectors to nearest airport." My emergency training kicked in automatically. First, maintain aircraft control. The citation was banking violently to the right due to the sudden loss of thrust from the right engine. I applied pressure on the left rudder and left aileron to compensate, but the force required was immense. Citation 847 Alpha, Los Angeles Center copies Mayday. Nearest airport is Flagstaff, 40 miles north. Vector 015, descent approved at pilot's discretion. 40 miles. With only one engine functioning and headwinds, that meant approximately 15 minutes of flight. 15 minutes to save 6 lives. "Dad, what's happening?" Sophia asked, her voice clearly frightened. "We had a failure in the right engine," I explained, trying to keep my voice calm while fighting with the controls. "We're going to make an emergency landing in Flagstaff. Everyone stay seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." But when I looked at the instruments, I realized the situation was much worse than I had imagined. Hydraulic pressure was dropping rapidly, the remaining engine temperature was rising, and most frightening of all, fuel flow was erratic. Carol was trying to calm Sophia, who had started crying. Michael took Julian's hand, who was pale as a ghost. Robert looked at me through the mirror, and his eyes silently asked if we were going to make it. Los Angeles Center, citation 847 Alpha. I'm losing hydraulic systems and have indication of fuel leak. Request maximum priority. Citation 847 Alpha. You have full priority. Fire trucks and ambulances are already being dispatched to Flagstaff. Report your altitude and intentions. We were at 38,000 feet and descending rapidly. Very rapidly. The left engine was working at its limit to maintain sufficient airspeed, but I knew I couldn't maintain that configuration for much longer. Descending through 35,000 for 10,000, estimating Flagstaff in 12 minutes. 12 minutes that felt like an eternity. The vibration was getting worse and worse. Through the small cockpit mirror, I could see fragments of the right engine that had punctured the wing. Fuel was leaking and being carried by the wind, creating a silver trail in the air. "Captain," Robert approached again, "be honest with me. Are we going to make it?" It was a question I didn't want to answer, but Robert deserved the truth. "I'm going to do everything within my power, Mr. Robert, but I need you all to prepare for an emergency landing. That means brace position when I call for it and be ready to evacuate quickly if necessary." He nodded gravely and returned to instruct the family. I saw Carol hug Sophia tightly, while Michael and Julian looked at each other with a maturity that shouldn't exist on such young faces. Gradually, the contours of Arizona's mountains began appearing through the clouds. Flagstaff was there, somewhere among those snow-covered peaks, but finding the airport was only half the problem. The other half would be managing to land with the systems I had left. Citation 847 Alpha, Flagstaff Tower. Runway 21 is clear and at your disposal. Wind 240 degrees at 15 knots, gusts to 25. Visibility 10 miles. 15 knots with gusts. Not ideal, but acceptable. What worried me was what I'd see when I started the final approach. At 15,000 feet, I managed to spot the airport. It was smaller than I expected, but the runway seemed adequate for the citation. The problem was, I'd have only one chance. With hydraulic systems compromised, the landing gear might not extend completely, the brakes might not work properly, and the flaps might not respond. Flagstaff Tower, citation 847 Alpha. I have the airport in sight. Request straight-in approach to 21. I have compromised hydraulic systems and may need the emergency system to lower the gear. Citation 847 Alpha. Cleared straight-in approach runway 21. Emergency equipment in position. At 8,000 feet, I tried to lower the landing gear. The indicator lights flickered several times before finally showing 3 green, gear down and locked. At least one thing was working. "Everyone in brace position now!" I shouted to the cabin. I saw through the mirror the family assume the position. Heads down, hands protecting their necks, feet firm on the floor. Carol was whispering what seemed to be a prayer, while Robert kept one hand on Sophia's shoulder and the other on Julian's. At 3,000 feet, I tried to extend the flaps. They came down only partially, giving me a landing configuration I'd never practiced in the simulator. The approach speed would have to be higher than normal, meaning a longer landing roll and greater risk of runway overrun. Citation 847. Alpha, you're high and fast. Runway is 7,000 feet. Confirm you can stop? High and fast. It was exactly the opposite of where I wanted to be. But there was no choice. The remaining engine was beginning to show signs of fatigue, and I couldn't risk a go-around. Negative on the go-around. I'm stopping on this approach. At 1,000 feet, mountain turbulence began shaking the aircraft violently. The citation rocked from side to side like a leaf in the wind, and I fought with the controls to maintain the approach path. 500 feet. The runway was right in front of me, but I was at least 20 knots faster than normal. The firefighters were positioned along the runway, and I could see the ambulances waiting. 200 feet. The ground proximity warning began sounding. Sink rate, 100 feet. I cut power on the remaining engine and raised the nose slightly for the flare. 50 feet, 40, 30, 20, 10. The citation touched the runway with a harder impact than normal, but all 3 wheels were on the ground. I immediately applied maximum braking, pulled the thrust reversers, only the left one worked, and prayed that friction would be enough. The runway passed quickly by the side windows, 3,000 feet remaining, 2,500, 2,000. The end of the runway was approaching dangerously fast, and our speed was still too high. 1,500 feet, 1,000, 500. Finally, with only 500 feet of runway remaining, the citation came to a complete stop. For a few seconds, there was total silence in the cabin. Then Carol began to cry, not from fear, but from relief. Sophia hugged Michael tightly. Julian murmured a "Thank you, God," and Robert simply looked at me through the mirror and said, "Thank you, Captain." Flagstaff Tower, citation 847. Alpha on the ground and safe. Request emergency crews inspect before we disembark. Citation 847 Alpha, copy. Outstanding job. The next minutes were controlled chaos. Firefighters inspected the plane to ensure there was no fire risk. Paramedics boarded to check that everyone was okay, and airport mechanics began assessing the damage. The right engine was completely destroyed. Metal fragments had punctured the wing in several places, and the fuel leak was worse than I had imagined. According to the chief mechanic, we had lost almost 40% of our fuel during the emergency. "Captain," the fire chief approached me. "In 30 years in this profession, I've rarely seen an emergency landing executed with such precision. You saved lives today." But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like someone who had failed to protect the people who mattered most to me. The Citation was destroyed. The family's vacation was ruined. And for a moment up there, I really thought we wouldn't make it. Robert approached while I finished the post-landing procedures. "Edward, I want you to know that you weren't just our pilot today. You were our guardian angel. Mr. Robert, I'm sorry for what happened. I know your vacation is ruined and the plane—" He interrupted me with a gesture. "Edward, things can be replaced. Planes can be repaired or bought again. But lives are irreplaceable. You brought my entire family back home alive. How can I be upset about that?" Carol approached and gave me a maternal hug. "Edward, son, you're part of this family. And today you proved that family takes care of family." Sophia, still with red eyes, approached shyly. "Captain Edward, I thought we were going to die up there, but you stayed calm the whole time. How do you do it?" It was a difficult question to answer. "Sophia, being a pilot isn't just about flying when everything is perfect. It's about finding solutions when everything goes wrong. And today, I had the most important motivation a pilot can have, bringing you all back to your lives." Michael, always practical, asked, "So what now? How do we get to Aspen?" Robert smiled. "Michael, don't you understand yet? We're already home. Anywhere we're all together and alive is home. We spent that night at a hotel near the airport. The insurance company was already arranging alternative transportation for the family, and I was coordinating with the maintenance company to assess what could be salvaged from the Citation. But that night, when I finally had a moment alone in my room, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. In 15 minutes, I had experienced every fear a pilot can have. The possibility of losing control of the aircraft, the responsibility of lives in my hands, the uncertainty of whether my experience would be enough to overcome an emergency that manuals classify as nearly impossible to survive. I called my wife that night. "Mary, I need to tell you what happened today." When I finished relating everything, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then she simply said, "Edward, I always knew you were an exceptional pilot, but today you were much more than that. You were a miracle happening at 43,000 feet. The next morning, the Henderson family decided to cancel the trip to Aspen and return to Dallas. Not because they were traumatized, but because, as Robert said, sometimes a scare like this makes you realize that the best place to be is home, with the people you love. The return flight was on a commercial jet, but Robert insisted I travel with them. "Edward, you're part of this family, and family travels together." During the flight, Carol asked me, "Edward, are you going to keep flying?" It was a question I had asked myself several times in the last 24 hours. "Mrs. Carroll, flying is who I am. Yesterday wasn't a failure on my part or aviation's part. It was an extreme contingency that fortunately ended well. If I stopped flying out of fear, I'd be disrespecting everything I learned and all the people who trust me." Robert nodded. "What about our arrangement? Do you still want to be our private pilot?" I smiled. "Mr. Robert, after what we went through together, I couldn't imagine flying for anyone else. You're not just my employers. You're my chosen family." 3 months later, Robert bought a new Citation X, identical to the previous one, but with some safety modifications I suggested. On the first trip of the new plane, Carol brought a small plaque she had installed on the panel. "Lone Star 2, protected by angels." "Edward," she said that day, "this plaque isn't about the plane. It's about you." Today, 5 years after that December day, I still fly for the Henderson family. Lone Star 2 has already taken us to dozens of destinations around the world. Each takeoff reminds me of the responsibility I carry, and each safe landing reminds me of the blessing it is to do what I love with people who became more than employers. Sophia got married last year, and I had the honor of transporting the entire family to the ceremony. Michael took over part of his father's business and is already planning expansion into new markets. Julian graduated in agricultural engineering and is revolutionizing the company's sustainable practices. Robert and Carol continue being the loving patriarchs they always were, but now with an even greater appreciation for the fragility and preciousness of life. Sometimes, when we're flying on a quiet afternoon, Sophia asks me, "Captain Edward, do you remember that day in Flagstaff?" How could I forget, Sophia? You know, you changed our family forever, don't you? Not just because you saved us, but because you showed us what really matters. And she's right. Those 15 minutes over the Rocky Mountains weren't just about an engine that exploded or a successful emergency landing. They were about discovering that family isn't just blood. It's about who stands beside you when everything is falling apart. It's about trust, courage, and the certainty that no matter what happens, you'll face it together. Every time I start the engines of Lone Star 2, I remember that being a pilot is much more than knowing procedures and managing systems. It's about carrying dreams, hopes, fears, and lives. It's about being the last resort between loved ones and the abyss. It's about transforming 15 minutes of terror into a story of triumph that a family will tell forever. Robert was right that day in Flagstaff. We're not just pilot and passengers. We're family. And family always finds a way to get home. Have you ever stopped to think how 15 minutes can define not just one life, but the destiny of several generations? How a decision made in a fraction of seconds can become the difference between tragedy and miracle. If you enjoyed this story from the skies and want to keep flying with me through other accounts of pilots who faced the impossible, subscribe to the Black Box channel. Leave a comment telling us what emergency situation you'd like to hear about in the next episode. And share this video with someone who also believes that the best heroes are those who make the extraordinary seem routine. See you on the next flight.